Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear colleagues, welcome here at the Bank of Slovenia, and also warm welcome to all of you who are following us over the WebEx. This is a second event in a series of government talk events at the Bank of Slovenia this year. Back in March, we hosted Estonian governor, Mr. Madis Miller. He was discussing inflation and especially differences in inflation rates between different euro area member states. And today I have a great privilege to host my dear colleague and friend Boris Vujčić, governor of Croatian National Bank. And he will be talking about euro adoption in Croatia, about the process, changeover, and of course about the first experiences in past few months. Now, the main motivation, of course, is to compare notes between what happened in Slovenia almost 16 years ago and what's happening now in Croatia, and especially draw some policy conclusions based on different environment at the time of entering Euro for Croatia and also for Slovenia. Now, for Slovenia in general, it was a very positive process, and the whole project of Euro in Slovenia still is very, very positive process and development. To start with, the first phase, the preparation phase, was very wisely used in Slovenia back then to implement some structural reforms, to change parts of the economy, to make the whole economy more market-based oriented, and also to do some structural reforms, especially related to inflation. So wage setting mechanism was changed, the way how we treated regulated prices back then were changed. At the end of the day, it was this first part. Preparations for the euro adoption were very successful part of the story. Then the actual changeover was also, I can say, flawless. Back then, it went very smoothly without any complications. It is true that it caused a small increase in prices, but it was relatively minor, especially looking at inflation developments from today's perspective. We estimated back then that it was only 0.3 percentage points, so very, very manageable one. And then, of course, there was a third phase, actually living, doing business with euro, which is also very successful. And there is a lot of empirical evidence that Slovenia weathered several episodes of economic, financial distress in past years better due to the fact that we were shielded by the euro, which is the second most important currency on a global level. And that's partly why we as citizens of Slovenia are among the biggest supporter of the euro project. According to Eurostat survey, 9 out of 10 citizens in Slovenia are supportive to the whole process. So I believe there are many parallels between what happened in Slovenia back then and what happened in Croatia only recently, and Boris will, of course, reflect on these parallels. But in addition, there are also some challenges ahead of us, and if I can just briefly go slightly back to history and remember that when we were entering euro, the economic environment in Slovenia and in Europe was very different. We were at the peak of the business cycle, and we actually entered the euro area, which was for us an environment with more favorable financial conditions as compared to those we had in Slovenia. So this led to big inflows of capital, of money to Slovenia, of credit to Slovenia. And at the end of the day, when the crisis happened back in 2008 and then onwards, we saw severe consequences of liquidity drying up in Slovenia, and all that contributed to severe decline of GDP back then. So for Croatia, the situation is probably different in this moment. The economic situation is different. Interest rates are on the increase, so financial conditions are getting tighter. And I believe this will be a good opportunity, Boris, to reflect also on this one. Maybe just to mention another difference between adopting euro today and 16, 17 years ago. And this is that today, partly as a consequence of this great financial crisis, we are having different regime of regulating the banking system. There is an SMS, or common regulatory framework, and this was also part of the process in Croatia, but not in Slovenia back then. So, not to be too long, it's an event dedicated to Boris and his explanation what's going on in Croatia. I would just like to welcome you again, Boris, and looking forward for an interesting reflection on what happened and what you are expecting in terms of benefits, but also in terms of risks for Croatia economy, banks, and corporate sector. So, Boris, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Boštjan. Thanks for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure to be here in Ljubljana, particularly in the Banka Slovenije, with my friends. And this time in particular, because I'll be talking about the introduction of the euro, as you said. And we know that Slovenia was the first of transition countries that got into the Eurozone. We are the last one to get in well, I'm not saying last one, but so far last one. I will, among other things, today try to say what are the differences. That's the first thing that I want to say today. Euro adoption process, how it looked then when you entered, and how it looks now. It has changed substantially, as you will see. Then a little bit about what you also said, a different context in which we introduced the euro. So we're the first country that introduces euro in the context of high inflation. All other countries have been introducing when inflation was low or even below the target. And finally, I'll say a few words about the motivation and the benefits, the way that we see them of adoption of the euro for a country like Croatia, for a small open economy in Europe. Some of our colleagues still think that it's not worth introducing euro. So I'm going to say, why do we think it's a good thing, and what were our experiences so far? So first, on the process, until the great financial crisis, and after that Eurozone debt crisis, the path towards the euro was fairly simple. So basically, you entering into the European Union, you had to achieve the required degree of legal convergence. That's the part of the EU entry, central bank independence and prohibition of monetary financing. And then country simply expressed the willingness to enter the ERM or not. Slovenia just said, we want to get in, and you got in. After that, you had to fulfill the nominal coverage criteria or the Maastricht criteria. There were no preconditions at that time for joining the exchange rate mechanism. So the process looked like this. You got into the European Union at the time that the country decided. Some did not. Slovenia was the first one to decide again. You entered into the ERM, and then it was only about fulfilling the nominal convergence, because the legal convergence was basically already there as a part of the process of negotiation, adopting the acquis communautaire. Now the things have changed after the global financial crisis and the Eurozone debt crisis. How, in a way, that the Eurozone architecture has been changed. So as a consequence of the crisis, the Eurozone has decided, to establish a banking union, though not yet completed. So at the moment, we have 2 pillars or 3 pillars of the banking union, SSM, single supervisory mechanism, and single resolution mechanism, while the deposit insurance system is still not there. Then macroeconomic imbalances procedure was introduced, and the European semester with the EU Council country-specific recommendation, CSRs. So all these changes now became a precondition for entering into the exchange rate mechanism. So for us, that was a difference than for countries that joined earlier, because we had to join the banking union at the time when we were joining the ERM. Basically, in October of 2020, we signed a close cooperation with the ECB, which de facto means joining the banking union, SSM, and single resolution mechanism. We had to fulfill all the requirements by the EDP and the macroeconomic imbalances. So we had to exit the EDP process and the process of macroeconomic imbalances, which was also not the case before. So that's also something that will be in place for any other country that decides to enter. We had to show the, I would say, reasonable degree of the implementation of the country-specific recommendations. No country almost fulfills all the CSRs, but you have to show the positive assessment on the, you have to have a positive assessment on the CSRs. And finally, we had to do a number of structural measures, including entry to the banking union, but not only entry into the banking union. Plus, we had to agree on some additional measures after joining the ERM. So these are all new additional requirements which did not exist before, but they exist today. So there's a difference in the process of joining the monetary union. So this is, for example, the policy measures that we had to implement before and after joining the ERM. So there were 19 policy measures in 6 areas. I wouldn't say that these are major structural reforms, but still, I mean, these are all things that had to be fulfilled within 12 months, basically, when we agreed to them before joining the ERM. And after they have been fulfilled, we joined the exchange rate mechanism. Some of the things are actually quite useful, and I think will be quite useful. Improvement in the public sector management, new guidelines for the corporate management in the state-owned companies. This is excellent thing to, so that this is something that you would like to do even without entering into the Eurozone. Some are like relatively light things which you would do anyway under the different other adjustments like the anti-money laundering framework, etc. In addition to that, we had a situation that on our path of joining the ERM and then the Euro, we had a few shocks that were definitely not planned. One was the COVID outbreak in early 2020. And this was at the time when we were about to join the ERM, when we fulfilled all the criteria, etc. So we were about to join the ERM in July. COVID happened in February, March of 2020. So at that time, everybody was dealing with the COVID. Nobody was dealing with anything else. Pretty much people were telling us, okay, wait, we're going to do it later, because now it's like the world is at a danger. We're all going to die maybe. So maybe we can postpone that. There was even a white paper commission who said that Croatia will join in 2024. But we insisted at that time, in spite of everything that was happening then. Now, already it might look like a distant past, but if you remember the atmosphere in February or March of 2020, I know that when I came from Brussels, which was my last trip before everything closed down, and there was something in the news that I said for 1 hour with our ambassador to the European Commission, and then she sat next to somebody in the council who later was diagnosed with the COVID. Like for a week, nobody would come to my office. That was the atmosphere at that time. So it was difficult to push through. Everybody stopped traveling, and we were about to get into the ERM. And finally, we insisted. Then there was an earthquake in Zagreb in March 2020. It's like, then December, Petrinja. So we had all these kind of things on the way, and finally, we had a surge in the in the inflation, which started at the end of 2021, and then through 2022, as we know, inflation continues to increase. However, in spite of all that, we managed to complete the process in the planned time. So 5 years after the publication of the Euro adoption strategy, we published the strategy in 2017. Then there was a public discussion in Croatia. Government adopted it in 2018. And 1st of January 2023, we got in, which is pretty much technically the fastest you can go now with the current process, five years. So when next country decides to join, it's 5 years to do all the necessary steps along the way. Then once we were on the way to the Eurozone, after we got into the ERM, we were at that time very confident that we will fulfill the Maastricht criteria in 2020, because we were fulfilling all the Maastricht criteria since 2016. It's just that we were not a member of the ERM, so we did not de jure fulfill them, but de facto we were fulfilling, so we thought it's going to be easy. And we did the Euro changeover plan, which is basically a plan which said how we will do the changeover, what Boštjan was saying, the technical aspects of the changeover. And we, in May 2022, then adopted the act on the introduction of the euro. The changeover was, like in Slovenia, very smooth and successful. And if you look at the decision of the EU Council on the euro adoption in Croatia in July 2022, basically immediately after the decision was made, the kuna cash in circulation started to decrease. So at the 1st of January, we were already at something like 50% of the kuna cash in circulation from the summer of 2022. So basically it was ex ante adjustment in the economy, which made the changeover easier, and it all went very smoothly. We did not have any incidents. We did not have any cases. The banks were not able to transfer the data within 24 hours. Internet banking, mobile banking, everything worked very well. I thought that something will go wrong somewhere of all the banks, but all went fine in terms of the technical changeover. As for the public support, interesting is that after the changeover, it already increased in February 2023. So we were doing this survey. As you can see, before, it was kind of hovering, going up and down. This is a Eurobarometer. And the other one, which is more detailed, which we do, showed, for example, that in September, the support was 58%, but then it went up to 63.5% already in February. And now we expect the support to continue to increase, because people were mostly afraid that the costs of living would go up so much that basically they would lose the real income. Now they see, most of the people are aware that that has not happened, although there has been a lot of outcry in January about the increases in prices like elsewhere. If we compare the support before the introduction of the euro to other countries, I don't know what was in Slovenia, but we were looking at the last 3 countries. These were the Baltic countries. Actually, supporting Croatia was higher, although it looks low, like at 55%, 61, 55. That's higher than it was in the Baltic states before they introduced the euro. Then after the introduction, the support increases. That's what the experience of other countries shows. And that has already started, as you can see, in Croatia. Now, what were the challenges in terms of the high inflation? So, as I said, we were the first country that introduced euro in the environment of high inflation. And as you can see here, as I said, since 2016, we were fulfilling all the convergence criteria. In terms of the inflation, even longer. Actually, inflation rate in Croatia was a bit lower than the euro average for last 10 years. But then, when the inflation started to increase at the end of the 2021 and 2022, then we surpassed the average in the Eurozone, as all Central and East European countries did. The fact that primarily the inflation surge was driven by the energy and food prices hit Central and East European countries more than the West European countries because of the composition of the basket, CPI basket, in which the food and energy consist higher proportion than in the West European countries. So you see that in all countries in Central and East Europe, inflation rates are higher. There are other also idiosyncratic reasons, I would say, why in some countries inflation rate is higher than in others. But basically, Slovenia has the lowest among Central and East European countries. Croatia second lowest, and there are other countries. But on average, this form of transition economies have at the moment higher inflation rate than the Eurozone average. Although, as you see, we had a lower inflation rate for 10 years before. So the problem was that the dispersion of inflation rates also increased a lot. And because of the Maastricht criterion, nominal convergence criterion, which says that you have to look at the three countries with the lowest level of inflation, if the dispersion increases, it becomes more difficult to fulfill the criterion by definition. However, we were able to meet the criterion. In April, the reference value was 4.9%, and the 12-month average inflation rate in Croatia was 4.7%. When that became clear, we were sure that we're going to get into the Eurozone, and we continued with the logistical preparations for the entry. The problem is also that high inflation has reinforced the public perception of the negative impact of the euro on living standard. When we asked, this is March 21, when we asked people what is the greatest risk of euro introduction, then you see all kinds of reasons. Some people say there are no risks. Some have this argument that we lose our own currency. This is kind of a more sovereignistic, as you say, reason. Decrease in incomes, problems due to the exchange rate conversion. But the main worry, by far the main worry, was increase in prices and the fall in the standard of living. People were afraid that when we introduce euro, their standard of living will go down, which is contrary to the experience of all the countries that entered into the Eurozone. But it's very strong public perception, which was created by Croatian journalists going to Slovenia, to Italy, to Germany, asking people what happened after the introduction of euro, and then people say, "Oh, prices doubled." And I see people thought, if they tell us that prices doubled, then our real income will go down a lot. So it was very difficult to dispel this, I would say, myth about the impact of the euro on the prices. However, in the end, we are capable now of doing a study on the impact of the prices very quickly because of the digital technologies. We did basically our estimate a month after the introduction of the euro. And we came with the conclusion that the estimated impact was mild, 0.4 percentage points, pretty much in line with the experience of other countries when they were introducing the euro. You said in Slovenia it was 0.3%. Basically, it was between 0.2 and 0.4 percentage points. We thought there's a greater risk in Croatia of a higher impact because the euro introduction happened in the high inflation environment. But in the end, it was not really much different than in other countries. Our estimate is actually saying that this is the upper bound of the possible impact of the euro introduction on the prices. And if you look at the reasons, or if you look at where this increase came from, basically came from services. January, February, here you see the 10-year average of the price changes for different components of the CPI, energy, food, non-energy, industrial goods and services. And you see what happened in 2023, January and February. So overall, actually, in January, inflation rate came down, which basically killed the discussion in Croatia about the impact of the euro. But this is because we were already on a downward path of the inflation, luckily. But then we estimated what would have happened if we did not introduce the euro. And our estimate basically says that the inflation rate would have fallen a little bit more in January and February than was the case. And that estimate says that the potential impact of the euro introduction was open 4 percentage points. But you can see that it happened entirely, basically, in the services sector, which saw higher increase in the prices than in previous years. So that is consistent with also experience of other countries where the prices of coffee, hairdresser, beauty salons, these kind of things went up more than the prices of the goods. Actually, what we did was that already on the 15th of January, we had the data which showed us that large retailers did not increase prices due to the euro changeover. And we found out that by web scraping their pages and looking at the prices of all of their products like IKEA, Zara, Bauhaus, Decathlon, Consum, which is a large retail food shop, and like they have 25,000 different products. We were looking product by product, 21st of December, 10th of January. And we were looking whether they increased the prices because of the euro changeover, and we found no evidence that they did so. But, okay, services we cannot web scrap, we cannot let the robot do the job because hairdressers and coffee shops don't have web pages where they publish their prices, but we then web scraped the Volt, who is a distributor and has a contract with 2,000 restaurants and cafes. And there, hairdressers, beauty salons that we couldn't do. But for example, for restaurants and the cafes, we saw that they really used the opportunity to increase the prices. Because the distribution, for example, of the prices of the coffee moved to the right-hand side, meaning that you had more expensive coffees on the 1st of January than you had in December. But what you saw then also was that day by day, like the 1st of January, 2nd of January, 3rd of January, the distribution became again a little bit narrower because some people discovered that probably they increased the prices too much, and then customers don't want to buy a coffee at their coffee shop, so they have to adjust. So you could see that the market really works. We also looked at something that we estimated before. How would introduction of the euro work through the rounding up of the prices? And we had an estimate before the changeover, how much that could increase the inflation. However, it didn't happen. So there was no rounding up. And you can see that best by looking at, but it was not significant. You can see that by looking at the so-called psychological prices or attractive prices. these are the prices that end up with 9. No? So most of the prices were ending at 9 or 0. And then in December 2022. And then in January, you see much more prices which are non-attractive, like 1.33 euros, 1.56 euros, etc. Which means that they were not rounding up as was feared by most. So we can say that that also did not happen. Last thing, motivation for the adoption of the euro. What the euro adoption brings to a country like Croatia. We are all highly euroized. We were highly euroized. I don't have to explain in this room what does that mean. It's a legacy of former Yugoslavia. So the biggest probably advantage of introduction of the euro is elimination of the foreign exchange risk. If you're highly euroized, there's embedded huge amount of foreign exchange risk in the system. Introducing euro, you simply do away with that. Then there's a greater capacity to respond to financial crisis, which creates a greater resilience, lower transaction costs and lower borrowing costs, which impact the competitiveness, which overall is positive for the economy of a country. If you look at the level of the euroization, in September 2022, currency composition of total debt in Croatia was such that 70% of all debt, meaning government, corporates, and household, was either in euro or indexed to euro. And 30% was only in domestic currency. So in foreign currency, debt of all sectors consisted 115% of the GDP. What does that mean? That means that the depreciation of the currency by 10% would increase the debt by 11.5% of all sectors, which means that the depreciation in case of a country like Croatia is pro-recessionary. It doesn't give a stimulus to the economy, but actually leads the economy into the recession. Why? Because it only positively affects the balance of payments, exports minus imports, but negatively affects the personal consumption, investments, and government spending. So households have less money to spend, the companies have less money to invest, and the government there has to increase the taxes or reduce spending when the currency depreciates. And that's why we couldn't use the currency depreciation ever as a monetary policy tool. And if you can't use it, I mean, why have it? It's only a risk that you have to deal with. So that was eliminated on the 1st of January. So we were also not then prone anymore to the problems that we had at the times of the crisis. There was no attack on the currency possible anymore. Our banks now have access to Eurosystem refinancing operations. We can benefit from the ECB monetary policy, which has much wider degrees of freedom than we ever had as a small open economy who had to keep the exchange rate stable. Credibility in financial markets is higher, and God forbid, hopefully never, but there is an access to the ESM funds if ever needed. So that creates the greater resilience to the financial crisis. And as I always have been arguing, the main benefit of a euro country feels during the times of crisis, not in good times. In good times, everybody's doing pretty well, so people tend not to see the real benefits of euro. But when the crisis starts, it's a huge difference whether you're in the eurozone or you are out of the eurozone, as I will show now. So if you compare, for example, 3 crises: global financial crisis 2008, pandemic crisis in 2020, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, you can see that during the great financial crisis, the pressure was huge, both on the currency, the red line, euro-kuna nominal exchange rate. When the crisis started, the currency depreciated strongly, although we were intervening a lot and increasing the interest rates because of the interest rate parity. The currency depreciated, and the government bond yield spread vis-a-vis the Deutsche Bunds increased by 400 basis points. So it's a huge increase in the spreads. You look at the next crisis, pandemic of 2020. This is when we were still neither in the Eurozone nor in the ERM. So it's again February 2020, when the WHO declared the pandemic. There was a huge pressure again on the currency. We had to intervene in 3 weeks with over 3 billion euros in the foreign exchange market in order to calm down the pressures, but the currency was depreciating anyway. And the pressure on the government bond yield started to increase, as you can see there in this yellow area. But we got the swap arrangement with the ECB then. And the moment the swap arrangement was announced, the pressure on the currency was gone. And because the pressure of the currency market was gone, we could intervene in the government bond market. If we had a continuous pressure in the FX market, we wouldn't be able to intervene in the government bond market, because that would only mean adding the oil to the fire, because we would be creating more domestic currency. After the FX market pressure stopped, we intervened in the bond market. We bought 6% of GDP worth of government bonds, and the pressure in the government bond market also stopped. And you can see that through that crisis, because we were on the way to the Eurozone, to the ERM, not being there, we already did much better. Otherwise, the cost would be much, much higher. And finally, Russian invasion of Ukraine, nothing happened. So that's where the markets were already pricing in that we're going to get into the Eurozone. So there was no pressure on the FX. A little bit you can see there, but insignificant. And the government bond yields moved basically as we were already the members of the Eurozone. So here you can clearly see that the biggest advantage of being in the Eurozone is during the times of the crisis, where being a part of this, being in the large tent, protects you from bad weather outside, and those that are not there have much more problems. Then there are lower transaction costs. I'm not going to dwell into that. You very well know they get reduced. Somebody loses, banking system, everybody else wins. It makes a country more resilient and more attractive. And here you can see the difference on the right-hand side. If you look at the Croatian sovereign yield spread versus the Euro area and the EU countries that decided not to join the Euro area. And you can see that now during the crisis, when we were already in the ERM, on the way to joining the Eurozone, Croatian government bond yields stayed very close to the Euro area average, while the yields of Hungary in particular, but also Czech Republic and Poland went much more up. So that I think clearly demonstrates the benefit of joining the Eurozone. And if you look at the transmission into the credit market, if you look at the interest rates on loans to non-financial corporations or the rates on housing loans, you can see that Croatia's rates are at the level of the Eurozone, and we're at the level of the Eurozone already almost before the entry into the Eurozone, when the markets were pricing in entry, while the rates in Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary went up a lot. I mean, Hungary, if you look at the rates, 16%, that means that basically there are no loans. I mean, nobody takes loans at these rates. So in a way, I mean, it's not something that you would be looking for, but the fact that we are now during the crisis helps to demonstrate the benefit of entering into the Eurozone, also to the domestic public in Croatia. And here I will conclude. So on one hand, the Euro adoption process has changed significantly since the time that Slovenia and other countries and Slovakia entered the Eurozone. It has become more demanding because of the change in the architecture of the Eurozone. We had that fortune to be also hit by the two shocks like the COVID and increase in the inflation on our road to the Eurozone, but we managed to do it in the shortest possible time, which is 5 years. And we already have seen the benefits of the road to the Euro adoption before adopting the Euro. So we were basically enjoying the benefits of this path to the Eurozone since 2020, since the start of the pandemic. So these are the Croatian Euro coins for the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Vujčić. If you have any questions for our dear guests, please raise your hand and introduce yourself and wait till microphone gets to you.
Thank you very much. Let me start. Thank you, Boris. So you have said the benefits of lower borrowing costs, but that brings also dangers, as we've seen in the past. Are you concerned about that, fueling the bubbles of domestic demand and not, let's say, contributing to fiscal consolidation? Thank you.
Well, definitely, there are also risks, as we have seen with some other countries when they joined the Eurozone. But I think that the change in the architecture of the Eurozone after the Eurozone debt crisis helps to alleviate these risks. Now you have to be in line with the EDP procedure. So you cannot have excesses that we've seen before in 2000, for example, which helps. But also I think that we are in a different environment now. I don't think that Croatia, for example, is at risk at the moment of excessive capital inflows into Croatia, which would build the unsustainable either foreign external position or the domestic debt position. That was the case in the run-up to the Eurozone debt crisis. In our case, I think it's very different. What happened during the last 2 years, as we were on the road to joining the Eurozone from 2020 until 2022, was that we managed to reduce the public debt from the level of 87% to 68%. So basically 19 percentage points in 2 years, just the opposite. And I would say that the road to Euro has helped in that respect. Without that, we would be reducing the public debt to GDP, as we were doing also 5 years before, but at a very slow pace. This has enabled a faster adjustment. So I would say, yes, theoretically, at some point there might be such worries, but at the moment, these risks are not there.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have two questions. First one is a kind of, I know it's early days, but would you do anything differently? That's number one. And second, what would be your lesson for the countries that are EU member states and have not yet adopted euro? Should they proceed? Should they wait? Should they link with, of course, your participation, the SSM, SRM, etc.? Thank you.
I would say that there's not much that we could do differently because the process is pretty strict and clear. So even if you would want to, there are maybe details, maybe something in the communication domestically, but otherwise, process is there and you have to follow it. In terms of the advice to other countries, my advice is join. And I was in Prague saying that, I was telling that in Warsaw and in Budapest, and I will continue exactly for these reasons. I see clear benefits, and I think that the data are there, which show that it's better to be inside of the Eurozone, and particular, and as I say, during the crisis. Of course, these countries have less incentive to join the Eurozone than Croatia, because they don't have a high Euroization as Croatia does have. They have a relatively small percentage of the foreign currency in their financial system, so they are faced with less risk. So in that sense, incentive is also lower. But still, during the times of the crisis, it's clear how the country that is out of the Eurozone gets hit more than if you are in the Eurozone.
Any more questions? Yeah, there's.
Hi, Ida here, working in inflation forecasting. I'm just wondering, during this time of high inflation, would you like to have the capacity, or do you feel that you would like to have the capacity to increase interest rates more than what is done by the ECB?
Well, this is a kind of a speculation about the counterfactual. I can answer in the following way. If we were out of the Eurozone, we would have been forced to increase probably the interest rates more because of the pressure on the foreign exchange market or the interest rate parity, which you have seen that has happened in some other countries. But now that we are in the Eurozone, we are in the Governing Council, and this is the place to argue whether we should increase and how much the interest rates.
Okay, any more questions?
This one here?
Yes?
Thank you very much. Xavier Darcy at Econostream Media. And I remember reading a comment back in January when Croatia joined that you would be the only person on the Governing Council with personal experience of hyperinflation. Now, I don't know if this is true, but how do your experiences of hyperinflation shape your approach to monetary policy? Have you maybe shared these experiences with your colleagues on the Governing Council? And what lessons can you draw from that for the present period that we're going through?
Yeah, I think that the experience, having seen what the hyperinflation means, because I've been witnessing the really hyperinflation. What we're seeing here is not the hyperinflation, but high inflation. There's a large difference between the two. But still, I think that the mechanics of the inflationary process is there in a sense that once people start to change their behavior in terms of the price setting, wage demands, getting used to the frequent price changes, this is something which creates the environment in which inflation is more difficult to stop. And I've seen that. I've seen it even to the at more extreme level. But I think that it is important to understand, and I would say that some of us, and Boštjan has also lived through the high inflation, and he's not that young, although he looks young. He remembers that, and we do know that once the inflation rate sets in motion, you have to do a lot to bring it down to 2%, and it's not the question of only temporary, let's say, supply side shock. If you look at what happened with the inflation, it had first kind of a combination of the supply and demand component at the end of the 2021, when the demand was recovering faster than the supply could respond due to the COVID, due to the change in the structure of the production demand. You had, for example, ports which were processing as much traffic as they did before the COVID, but they couldn't because there was a shift from goods demand to from services demand to the goods demand. So they were not set up to be able to process all that. Then to the shock after the Russian invasion on Ukraine, which was clearly a supply side shock on the energy and food prices in particular. But if you understand the inflation, how it works, it doesn't matter whether something is even a supply shock. It will become a demand shock later on, because this supply shock then filters through the increased prices of the transport, etc. And then people start to see the decline in their real purchasing power, and they start to demand higher wages. And then you get into the cycle. So it's true that the monetary policy cannot do much about the supply side shocks. But supply side shocks do not end up only being supply side shock. It's almost like an impulse response function. You create an impulse, then the prices go up, and then they start after some time becoming a demand side driven. For example, under our estimations, that now the inflation is more demand side driven than the supply side driven, and you wouldn't have had this kind of a demand pool if you didn't have the supply shock in the first place. And that's how this is the logic of the animal, which is called inflation. And we have to be, I think, vigilant enough to try to bring it down as soon as possible, because also if it stays elevated for a longer period of time, then it builds into expectations. And once it gets built into the expectation, it's more difficult and more costly to bring it down. Sacrifice ratio is higher. I think the sacrifice ratio is lower if you can do it in a shorter period of time than if you prolong the process.
Okay, any more questions?
I have a question. Boris, a couple of months ago, I think in October, we were both in Split talking to financial experts, and I was talking about Slovenian entrance in Europe and in Euro and effects and so on. And then I got the question there, and somebody claimed that, okay, Slovenia entered Euro in the times of low inflation rate. And this time in Croatia, it will be different. And then I didn't know exactly what to answer. I didn't want to say it will be different, but now I'm happy that the results that you presented are as you presented. So I was hoping at that time that this will happen, but at that time nobody knew. So congratulations for that. And I was wondering, will you let's say monitor prices even in the future, or will you stop?
No.
Because I think this is, let's say, if people knew and if companies knew, then they would stay in this level. Otherwise, they might postpone, and then in a couple of months rise and adjust prices.
No, you're right on the first thing that at that time we didn't know. We also hoped that in the higher inflation environment there will be not higher impact on the price, but we could even expect that there will be somewhat higher. We didn't expect a lot, but because it's higher inflation environment, it could have a higher effect. It did not, to a large extent, also because of the campaign public pressure on the companies, which does not mean that they might not. For example, you saw that they have not rounded up prices. They might do it after a few months because these are attractive prices, and this is in a way a policy of the companies to have this type of the price in normal times. However, they might do it in a way that they lower them or increase them. And that will depend, I think, not on the fact that we went through the euro introduction, but it will depend on the part of the cycle in which we are. And now the growth is slowing down. As growth is slowing down, the ability of the companies to increase prices will go down. For example, last year, you had increasing inflation, high growth, 6.3%, falling unemployment. You had all the ingredients for companies to be able to increase the prices. Now I think the things are changing. And again, we don't know as we didn't know then with certainty, but if I may say, what I would expect is that the ability of companies to increase prices will come down slowly, and that this will be the first area where we will see the decline in the price pressures. Wages went up a lot. We discussed it. That could eat into the margins of the companies. And can also, the risk is that that can also increase the demand for the services, particularly these contact services, which are usually most sensitive to the wage growth. But we'll see. There will be forces pulling in one way and the other, and I don't have a definite answer. But I would think that the ability of the companies this year to increase prices will be substantially still lower than it was last year, when everything was basically working in that direction.
Okay, we have one more question here in the third row.
Hvala. Christian Hvala from the Banking Association. You have noted briefly the effects of the changeover on the banks in terms of lost fees and commissions. I would be interested in the effects of the changeover on the banking system in terms of profitability. I'm sure you have some estimates or already exact figures. Banks have incurred some direct costs. They were one-off, but also in terms of lost income from the forward-looking perspective, and perhaps also in terms of comparison with other countries that have entered Eurozone.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. The estimate of the lost income of the banks, exchange officers who had contracts with the banks is approximately 200 million euros, a little bit less than 200 million euros per year, which is significant from the foreign exchange transaction fees, etc. And one of cost was also significant adoption of the euro, but that is one-off. That will not affect the bottom line of the banks going further. But at the moment, the banks are in part of the cycle where the profits are actually increasing. So you won't see decrease. They will increase less because of that, but they will go up. And one of the reasons why they go up is that they get remunerated now much more for the excess reserves, which are at historical high. And that will certainly help the banks to do very well in the near future.
Okay, if there are no more questions, one more question. Okay.
Mojca Križnar from the Governor's Office of the Hosting Governor. I have perhaps to complete a more personal question to you, and that is, or first to acknowledge that we are hosting here the world's best governor.
No.
And I just wanted to ask, what does it take from a governor to be recognized as the world's best governor? And in addition, what is the next nomination the world's best governor could be aspiring for?
Thank you very much. I don't know why I ever became the best governor in the world. Some panel decided like that. You should ask them. But I always only try to keep inflation as low as possible and exchange rate as stable as possible. These are my two only aspirations. And of course, to keep the banking, we didn't talk that much about the banks, but to keep the banking system also stable, which is extremely important, as we have seen over the last month or so. And one thing that I hope I bring as an experience to the Governing Council is the fact that they closed down some 30 banks and know a little bit about that, if ever necessary. And we also, I think Boštjan and me have a nice experience that also not many people in Europe at the moment have, and that is resolving a bank under the single resolution mechanism in a way that was not done before in Europe since the single resolution mechanism was established. That was a Sberbank, both in Slovenia and in Croatia. That was, I would say, the first full-blown resolution. There was a Banko Populare also, but a little bit easier, I would say, case within the structure of the SRM. So I'm there if anybody needs any advice on that as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Governor, for your visit, for your interesting lecture. Thank you all for coming, and have a nice day.